Hello, all. Please tell me if you can hear me. Hi, Ed. Hi, Eric. Hi, Teresa. Oh, hello. How's everyone doing this evening? And again, I hope I'm coming through. So thanks for checking out this live session. It was kind of on a whim a little bit. And if you've known me by now, I'm beginning to and continuing to wrap my head around the really complex shipbuilding programs for World War II. So I know this is a topic that not everyone is interested in, but if you are, thank you, and thank you for being here. So what I've done is I've put together kind of the lead up to 1939, all right, which is kind of really the fiscal year 1939 and the building programs that America's really getting ready for potential entrance into World War II. So what I would ultimately like to do is I would like to do a video like this for every year. But you'll see it's pretty labor intensive with the PowerPoint that I have. And not that that's a bad thing. It just would probably take me some times. Well, thanks, Eric. Thank you. I appreciate it. So let's just dive right in. I'm kind of turning my head this way because that's where my microphone is. So I hope if I don't turn it and I look at the screen, hopefully you can still hear me pretty well. So this is a resource that I got. It was from another resource, and gosh darn it, I just don't know. I just can't remember where I read about this source. But somewhere I read that this edition of the magazine, I should do that even though it's normal like that, but they have it on the side, Warship International from 1981. All right, and I've battered it so badly already, it's come apart. Lists the naval programs for World War II. All right, so this was the beginning of the article, US Navy building programs during World War II. So very quickly, I will kind of show you what that means. If I can find a page here that kind of represents it. Okay, so it will list the title, right, and then all of the ships built underneath it, the program, the year that it was authorized, or the date that it was authorized and appropriated, and then usually where the ship was constructed. Now, this, to my knowledge, is about 50 pages long. So that's what I mean. It would be very labor intensive to go through it, but I'd like to. And so maybe for the next video like this, I will do the fiscal year 1940, which would certainly be a little more than the 72 vessels that I'll be talking about today. All right, so again, I came across this resource. It said, see Warship International number 3, 1981 for more information. And so I found it online on eBay and I purchased it. So let me get back to, and this is what I'll be talking about today. All right. The building program for 39, and then also the experimental program for 1939. All right. So let us away with the presentation. Hello, full slide. All right. Again, hope you can see that. Okay. And again, please, now when I'm in this mode, I can't see questions or comments. So please leave them and know when I minimize the screen after the PowerPoint, I can get to them. Or just hold them until that time. All right, so I'm going to briefly and quickly go through what was leading up to 1939 as best as as much as I feel like that should be covered in this sort of topic. All right, so you have the Washington Naval Treaty. All right, if you're a fan of shipbuilding and restrictions and limitations, this is something that might be a passion of yours as well. Very briefly, the 5 belligerents, Italy, Japan, France, Great Britain, and America, got together in Washington. They didn't want to see a repeat of World War I, and they didn't want to have this out-of-control arms race between belligerents and countries. So what they did was they put a cap for the Washington Naval Treaty. They put a cap mostly on battleships, aircraft carriers, and also battle cruisers, which ultimately led to probably the death of the battle cruiser. So to be in compliance with this treaty, the United States scrapped about the equivalent of roughly 30 ships that were either already being constructed or in the planning stages. What they found, and you look after the fact, is that other countries weren't adhering to the treaty so succinctly as America was. Then you have the London Naval Treaty, 1930. Now what they did with the cruisers, with the battleships and the aircraft carriers, they now did with cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. All right, so the biggest distinction being armament and tonnage for cruisers, distinguishing the heavy and light, 8-inch, 6-inch overall tonnage. Destroyers, I think, were capped at 1,850 tons, and submarines, oddly, were capped at 2,000 tons. And so you're capping each individual submarine, but then also in the overall, for both treaties, you're capping the number of aggregate tonnage. All right, and that's one of the things when you're talking about the building programs, that prior to the 11% expansion and the 70% expansion, which I don't cover today because that's fiscal year 40, is all appropriations and authorizations were for a finite number of ships at a finite tonnage. So they would say, you're going to build 5 cruisers, whatever, as an example, you can build 5 cruisers at 9,000 tons each. So that would be 45,000 tons aggregate. Is that right? 9 times 5? Yes. So after the 11% expansion and the 70% Two-Ocean Navy Act, what they then did was they just aggregated all of the tonnage into one big pool, and then they pulled from it. So it almost makes it more difficult to have, and they kept excellent records, obviously, but just while they're on the ground in the moment, it made it a little harder to distinguish between what is what tonnage, what for record keeping purposes alone, for like contracts and things like that, when they were doling out contracts and bids, because now you just have one big aggregate that you pull a ship from here, as opposed to prior to 1940, every ship had its own tonnage connected to it. Anyway, thank you. Okay, so in 1933, the U.S. Navy had roughly about 370 ships in service, and of those, about 280, don't have that percentage off the head, were overage ships. And so Vinson-Trammel, Carl Vinson and, Martin Trammel, I can't remember his first name, 2 Democrats from the South get together and come up with the VT Act of 1934. One of the principles states that sea power consists not of the number of warships, but of how modern and how underage they are. And so that principle then becomes naval doctrine. So you're having a congressional act that's so well written that it now becomes part of naval doctrine itself, is that it's not the number of ships, it's what is the percentage of overage versus underage, what is the percentage of modern versus antique, for lack of a better word, everybody. But what this act did was it appropriated monies for about 102 vessels to be built between 1934 and 1942. This wasn't for new construction. This was for when ships were being scrapped. Now you have money over those 8 years to replace them. All right, so that's an important distinction, is that it's not for new construction to build on. It is for, putting an act in place for replacements and having that money already dedicated and secured so the Navy can just get rid of unmodern vessels as they see fit. Then, of course, in 1936, you have the Second London Naval Treaty. By now, Japan has already been in conflict with China. Italy is annexing parts of Africa, so they drop out. They don't even want to have anything to do with this Second London Naval Treaty. But what that does is it allows the Allies to put in this escalator clause. So if they say, Japan and Italy, if you're not going to sign the Second London Naval Treaty by mid-1937, I think it is, we have the now ability to escalate up our battleship building up to 16-inch guns and the tonnage maybe up to the 45,000 tons, up from 35,000 tons. So they snuck that in there, probably calling the bluff that Italy and Japan wouldn't be signing, and then that gives them legal right to escalate up their battleships. So we'll call this the interwar step-up program. This is what Ernest King, Fleet Admiral as CNO, Ernest King called this 1930s, was kind of like the step-up program. All right, so in his reports to the Secretary of the Navy during World War II, he also covered the interwar period, which I used in this research as well. And so he calls this time the step-up program. The Navy's beginning to step up after the 20s. And the treaties. So in 1932, the Farragut-class destroyers are constructed, and they're the first new destroyer class in about 12 years. All right, I believe they were actually, the money was actually appropriated to them for World War I in like 1916. But just with the building, they didn't get to them. And then, of course, now the treaties happen and they stop construction. So these, obviously, they updated the designs, the plans, and modified them with more, obviously, modern technology. But it's really interesting that the 8 Farragut class were actually appropriated by Congress in 1916, and they just weren't built until 32. So in 1933, FDR now, he says, well, we need to step up the Navy's building program, and they commit to 2 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, 20 destroyers, and 4 submarines. And now you're getting in the mid-30s, you're getting into now the battleship replacement. Oops, I'm sorry, I have London Treaty there. I mean Washington Treaty, my mistake. It's the Washington Treaty. I'm going to have to talk to my editor about that. I'm kidding. That's me. So from the Washington Treaty, now you can replace battleships. They start with the 2 North Carolinas. Then in 38, they go with the 4 South Dakotas. And then in 1939, they go with the 4 Iowas. So after that, after 1936, and while they're beginning to ramp up the battleship programs, now comes the Naval Act of 1938, which is sometimes known as the Second Vinson Act. And so again, to refresh, while the Vinson-Trammel Act of 34 deals exclusively with replacing overage tonnage, now this act now increases 20% on top of, so you have money allotted for replacements, again, back in 34, the 102 over the course of 8 years, and now you're adding a 20% on top of that. So this 20% increase really becomes, it sounds like a lot, but based on the tonnage at the time, That really becomes the USS Hornet, the 4 Atlanta-class light cruisers, and the first 2 Cleveland-class cruisers, Cleveland and Columbia, I believe, which are appropriated in fiscal years later, fiscal years 40 and 41 maybe, or just 40. Although, again, muddy waters now, some of this tonnage may have come from the replacements of the 1934 Act. But there's a nice shot of the Hornet being constructed. There's the USS Atlanta up in the... Sorry, folks, that's the only pictures I have for this presentation. Sometimes a no-no. It's good to have a lot of photos. Okay, so we've covered, 22, 32, 33, 34, 36, 38. Now we're into 1939. And what I'm going to be doing when I lay out this index for you is these numbers that you'll see, 5A, 5AA, 5B, come from this report in Warship International from 1981. And what these numbers represent, these were the accounting numbers at the Bureau of Ships for the various authorizations and appropriation acts for contract indexing purposes. All right, so obviously you've got contracts flying out the door, ramping up in 1939. So this was an internal indexing system that they used to identify the programs. All right, and again, a little muddy water here, but I may have figured it out. If you have questions, or if you have a better understanding and maybe I'm not getting this fully right, please leave a comment. So the 5A, and you'll be seeing these when I talk about the ships. 5A represents the fiscal year 1939 authorizations for the 1934 Vinson-Trammel Act. So now that's replacement, all right? Replacement of overage ships. Not expanding, just replacing. The 5AA, this is what really confused me, all right? 5AA is also listed as authorized VT, Vinson-Trammel, but without other designations, my thinking is it's prior to fiscal year 1939. And as you'll see in the index, this really accounts for the USS Massachusetts and the USS Alabama. So, of course, they build the first 2 South Dakotas. Then there's some discussion. There's some tonnage discussions, of course, with the General Board and the Navy. And so what I'm thinking is these were still fiscal year 38 under the Vinson-Trammel Act of replacement tonnage. But it's only those two South Dakota battleships. 5B now is the 20% expansion of the 1938 Act. 5X was the fiscal year 1939 authorization for 6 auxiliaries, but you'll see that they actually didn't construct 6 auxiliaries. And then 6 was the program for experimentation. Right, awards were given out from 2nd of August 38 through 13 December 1939. It's broken in this index here in Warship International. It's broken into the building program of fiscal year 39 and the experimental program of 1939. In all, 72 ships of many disparate classes were constructed in 39. So to help you understand, so you don't have to keep flipping back or whatever, I list again the program numbers and letter designations up here at the top. Hope you can see those. All right, so you have the Hornet, which is CV8 5B, 20% expansion, like I mentioned. The Hornet, the 20% expansion really was the Hornet, the 4 light Atlanta class AA cruisers, and then down the road for the 2 Clevelands. So I don't cover the Cleveland, and again, I think it's Columbia is 56, I think. Then you have the 4 South Dakota BBs, 57, 58, 59, 60. And as you'll see, 2 are just under the authorization from 1939 specifically, but then 2 are listed as this VT potentially before 1939 was the appropriations. Again, that's muddy. If you have better thoughts on it or different thoughts, please leave a comment. Then you have the four CLAAs, 51, 52, 53, 54. They were all under the 20% Expansion Act, like the USS Hornet. And then you have the Gleaves class. All right, so on the right-hand side there is the Gleaves. There's 8 of them. The first 2 Gleaves were, so they skipped a few years. The whole numbers skip. I think Gleaves itself is 423. I think I probably am wrong, but 424 maybe. So they skip a couple hull numbers. And then, so this was, the Livermore was actually the 3rd Gleaves class, so constructed. And so they've put in for 8 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, yep, 8. And that's all under the 34 Vinson-Trammel Act, 1934, of replacement. Then you get into the T-boats with the Tambor class. All right, so that's again 5A. That's being authorized from the 1934 Act of replacement tonnage. Then you have the Tautog, the Thresher, the Triton, the Trout, the Tuna. All right, all under the same act. So that whole class gets built under the authorization of modern tonnage from the 34 Act, authorized for 1939. Then you have the Raven, which is a minesweeper, 55, under the 5X program, which is one of the 6 auxiliary programs. Then you have the Osprey, another minesweeper. That doesn't fall under the auxiliary program, though. That falls under the 20% expansion. And then you have Destroyer Tender, falling under the 20 expansion. Then you have the Fulton, a submarine tender, falling under 5X, which is the 6 auxiliary program. And then you have 3 tugs, all named after Native American tribes, the Navajo, Seminole, and Cherokee. One of them is the auxiliaries. 2 of them are the expansion. The Albemarle, which is a seaplane tender, that's a 20% expansion in the Barnegat, which is a small seaplane tender, 10 and 11, both under the 20% expansion. And then the USS Terror, love that name. That was a fleet minesweeper, and that also is a 20% expansion. And then for the experimental programs for 1939, these weren't named. So you have 5 subchaser patrol craft, PC 449 through 453, a total under the experimental program number 6. You have 20 torpedo boats being constructed, 1 through 20, again under the experimental program. 12 motorboat subchasers, PTCs, 1 through 12, again experimental, and aircraft catapult barge, 1 AVC, all right, also under this program as well. That's a very unique ship. I'd like to do a little more experimenting in that as well for that particular vessel. Okay, stop sharing. All right. Now I got to kind of play catch up. Hey, thanks for being here, everybody. I really appreciate it. Wow, there's a lot of comments here. So, okay, I might have to get on my glasses. So, please leave questions. Motorboat subchasers, yes. Yeah, there's a lot. Obviously, there's a lot in here that could really be a great resource for individuals. And this is the first step. This index, something like this would be the first step. And then finding more research. All right. So the experimental, yep, the PTCs 12 motorboat subchasers. Sweet. So this can start you down the slide and then finding other research to do so. Thanks, Charlton. That was a good one. BB-62, you mean? No, I'm just focused right now on the South Dakota classes. Carriers also weren't proven. Yes. Gifted 5. Thank you, Eric. Go Sabres. All right. Yeah, there were a few aircraft carriers constructed. That was from the Washington Treaty of 1922. So prior to 40, all right, each ship had its own tonnage appropriated. After that, aggregate tonnage. And so then they picked that gave them the flexibility to pick and choose what they needed to build at the time. Right? You know, depending on the threats, of course, they could say, okay, great example is the Independence class carriers. Would they have had that flexibility to take the 9 Clevelands, including USS Buffalo, to have the flexibility to then convert them into Independence class? Well, I really want to thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed. And again, if I'm not getting a comment here. Oh, thanks, Ed. Thanks. Why were auxiliaries included in tonnage as they are not warships? Great question, Charlton. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have the answer to that. The auxiliaries are listed in the building programs. And then again, as you saw, what program based on number and small case letter they come from. So again, this is just kind of opening that window. I mean, this is very dense information. So I try to take it all and try and parse it out as succinctly as possible. Amazing. Thank you. Wasn't the WASP a tonnage replacement for the Langley? That's a great question too, Tim. I would have to look that up. So that could have, the Vinson-Trammel of 34 went up to 42. So that now you're getting into fiscal years, even into appropriating into 43 as well. So that's a great question. Well, I do want to thank you, everybody. Again, please leave a comment down below in the video. And then, as you guys know, I answer 99.9% of them. Well, we'll see you again soon. And thank you all for being here. And thank you. I'll just write a note thanking everybody. Thank you all. Yes, just right before I wrap up, Robert, was there USS Putnam built? Yes, there was. That was the namesake of before the Sullivans. They changed the name in February of 43 from Putnam to the Sullivans, and it eventually became a destroyer. But the hull number is, I don't know it offhand. It might be in the 800s. So they didn't tack it on to another Fletcher. It was a later class, the Sumner class, or a later class. So thank you. You're welcome, everybody. Hope you enjoyed. Have a good night, everyone. And we'll see you again soon.